now. Okay, so we've looked at blocking out before, and I've shown you how to not only block out an entire scene and the importance of blocking out an entire scene before you actually start modeling it, but also how you would sort of block out individual objects and elements as well. I'm going to show you, I'm not going to do a block out today, then I'm going to show you a sort of the creation of an asset that I'm going to do in Maya, and I'm going to bring to Substance and do a little bit more advanced Substance work on it after the break. Nothing too complicated though. If you got the gist of what Substance was about last week, then it should still be fairly, what I'm going to show you after the break should be fairly straightforward and understandable. But before the break, I want to show you some modeling and how quick, potentially how quick, you could model parts or details of your Mars base. Now remember how I think a couple of weeks ago I was talking, about these primitives, but I think I also mentioned how when you get real professional, so to speak, you can start with a plane and you can make virtually any object with a plane rather than a cube or a sphere, so to speak. Why would you want to start with a plane rather than a cube or a sphere? Well, a plane can be the most simple possible object that there can exist in CG. So so at its most simplest, a plane looks like that. I'm going to turn off grid. So it's literally one polygon. The advantages of starting with this very, very, very simple one polygon object is that it's going to have the least amount of stuff that comes with it. There's not much baggage with it, so to speak. If you create a cube, it's an enclosed surface, but you might never see the underside, the floor of the object. You can make a cube easily enough with a plane by just selecting all of the edges and then extruding them down. And there you are, you've got a cube. But you've got the advantages of the fact that it's an open at the bottom kind of cube, which means it's one whole less polygon to get in the way. So working with planes, I would encourage you to try this out. And when you see how I do this kind of science fiction panel-y kind of wall thing, hopefully you'll see how easy it is to work with planes and how you can still build up, I don't know, cool looking objects or reasonable looking objects with planes, okay? I also want to use this as an excuse to show you some symmetry modeling as well. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. So I've got this 1 by 1 by 1 kind of plane at the moment. It's just got one polygon in it. What I do want though, I do want one subdivision in it. And I want a subdivision right down the middle. But again, I'm going to turn off grid temporarily because I'm going to model symmetrically along that line. And it's going to make life a lot easier and a lot quicker. But first of all, I also want to get the pivot point here because I'm going to rotate the whole thing in a moment. And as I've gone through the various weeks gone by, I've talked about how useful it is to reposition the pivot point of your object to somewhere more sensible, often lying on the edge of an object or the corner of an object. So I'm going to go to vertex, I'm going to select that vertex, and I'm just going to center the pivot point onto there. So now, that's where the pivot point is. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this like that. I'm holding down J so I can snap the angle rotation. And then I'm going to move it back to sort of like the origin. Again, I'm going to hold X and I'm going to snap it just there. And I'm going to quickly snap it to the base of the grid like that. And this is how I'm going to start off making my wall panel. And it's all going to be done, it's going to virtually all be done with just extruding edges and beveling edges. I'm going to be using slightly more of this extrude button, and I'll show you why. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to turn on symmetry as well, just show you what symmetry does. So in the modeling toolkit, you've got symmetry just up here. By default, it should be off. Now if you click it on, you've got a bunch of options. Now you normally want object X, Y, and Z, but it might take a bit of experimentation about which one of these you want, depending on the orientation, which way this object is facing. I'm going to try X, and that's the right way. Now, as you can see now, instead of highlighting in that kind of peachy kind of color, now highlights in this thick blue line. And what I do to one, I only need to select one of these edges, and it automatically selects the other one. So if I move one edge now, it moves the same on the other side. And it's not just moving, it's also extruding. So if I extrude it now, it's going to automatically extrude on the other side. So I could do stuff like that and very, very quickly build up like walls and things like this. And all of these modeling operations here will work with symmetry. And you can use that then to model really, really quickly objects that might look more complicated than you might think. So I'm going to model this wall panel. I've got a rough idea of what I want it to look like, but I'll do a little bit of jazz improvisation and make it up as I go along as well. So I'm going to move, so I'm only selecting one edge, even though it looks like I've got two edges selected. I only needed to select one because I've got symmetry on. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit, and I think I'm going to then hold shift and extrude this inwards a little bit, like this. And then what I might do is go to face mode, select just this one face, and then just shift it up, and just kind of eyeball it into roughly the right kind of position. It's not too important. I mean, as I said, I've got a rough idea what I'm making, but it's nothing set in stone here. So I'm going to go to edge selection, select this edge, and the first thing I'm going to do now, I'm going to use bevel, but I'm not going to use bevel to create like a nice sharp line, or well, I should actually say to slightly soften a very, very sharp line. In this case, I'm going to use bevel to literally shape this thing out a little bit. So I'm going to click bevel once. I'm actually going to give it more than one segment. And I'm going to increase the fraction here. I'm going to also turn this down to slow, because I want my wall panel to have a nice kind of curved top, and then the rest of it to be more sort of sharp and angular. And I think this is nothing really to do with CGI in this case. It's more to do with design, I guess. So if you're concept artists, which all of you to one person is, then also pay attention to this bit. You want to kind of mix up in your designs of your things, whatever you're designing, a nice combination of curved kind of surfaces and harder, sharp edge kind of surfaces. And if you get a nice proportion of that, a little bit like the big, medium and small thing, then your designs will just tend to look that little bit more pleasing. So I'm going to put another couple of segments into here, so I get this kind of smooth, curved kind of top part. And I think that's going to be good. I'm okay with that. So it's all right. It's a good base, but obviously let's start actually very quickly showing you how this builds up. So I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to hold down Shift and double click this edge. And this gives me all the edges in between. So this is another thing that you can kind of remember in Maya. If you select one edge and then you hold down Shift and select another edge a bit further along, it will, as much as it can, try and connect up those edges. If you want the whole edge loop, remember, you just double click an edge and that will select the whole edge loop round. But I just want that one and this one, so I'm going to hold down Shift and double click it. Now I'm just going to do a whole bunch. Actually, you know what I'm going to do first? I'm going to pull this in a little bit because it's a bit too wide. Right, now I'm just going to do essentially a whole bunch of these extrudes, one after the other, to build up this shape. So I'm going to extrude once, and I'm going to pull it in. I'm going to change this to medium, I think. Put it in a bit like that, because I want the wall to go in and then have like a series of kind of little indentations and sort of big kind of bevels. So I'm going to pull it in maybe a bit like this, and then I'm just going to hit extrude again, and I'm going to pull it out a little bit like that. Extrude again. Back out. It almost models itself if you do it this way. It's ridiculously easy. So I encourage you to try this kind of thing when you're doing kind of wall details and anything kind of techie, which being a Mars base, it probably will be. Apart from the, there's actually more than one Castle Mars base, I've realised now, which is interesting. Right. And then we pull this bit out because I want a secondary kind of little, I'm trying to do that big, medium, and small thing. So this is my big kind of shape. Well, my big shape is going to be the overall wall panel shape. Then I'm going to have these kind of medium shapes and then these kind of smaller little indentations and grooves, which I think hopefully will make it look decent. So move it out a bit like that, hit extrude again, and then sort of pull it in. This time a little bit further, because I also want the wall to sort of have like a surface that sort of juts out, and then the next indentation doesn't come out quite as much, and then the last one comes out even less so. So the whole thing has a kind of little steppy kind of feel to it. So I'm going to pull it in a bit like that, hit extrude again, pull it out like this, And you know what? I'm going to leave it at that. That's going to be my rough sort of sci-fi wall panel-y kind of shape. Okay, so what do I need to do though next? I've built out the rough kind of form, and I've done it fast, but at the same time I've done it in a very sort of step by step, not jumping all over the object, just doing a whole series of extrusions of a single, or actually a selection of edges to get this shape. Next thing I want to do though, because if I hit 3 at the moment, and remember if you hit 3 you get what's called a smooth mesh preview, and it's called a preview for a good reason, because it's technically not actually changing the polygons that you see. It's simply giving you a display of what this would look like if you smoothed it. Now what gets it even more confusing is that the Arnold renderer though will render this smooth if I press 3 and I've rendered it. If I press 1 and render it in Arnold, it will render like this. But this is called smooth mesh preview. At the moment it's a bit too blobby. I want some kind of definition, because I am going to what they call sort of bake in the smoothness in a moment. But to get these nice edges happening, I'm going to have to put these kind of support loops in that again I briefly mentioned last week. So if I select that one and go down to here and select that one, double click, I'm going to now add a series of bevels to do this. You know what though, I might do this in more than one sort of stage, because I quite like the idea of this kind of chamfered bit going on. So you've got like a combination of hard 90-degree turns, but then you've got some nice kind of sloped chamfered turns. Yeah, and this is another thing, not technically part of Intro to CGI as such. This is more design based, but I think it's important because you want obviously the best looking object that you can make. No one wants to make a crappy object. So I'm going to use one bevel to sort of further shape out that wall panel. So I think that looks even more sort of cliche sci-fi looking, but that's the look I'm going for, so I don't mind. So this time I'm going to use a bevel though to harden that edge up by selecting the edges, then clicking bevel, and this time I'm going to have 2 segments and it's going to be a lot smaller. So I'm going to tighten it up like this. And I'm going to do the same on a whole bunch of the other edges. So these are just single edge loops, so I can just actually double click these. So I'm going to do another bevel, a bevel, and I'm going to shrink that in so it's nice and tight. And at any point I like, obviously I can just hit 3 and see how that's going. And I'm going to click off the object and click off the wireframe. Yeah, that's the kind of look I want. I want that kind of machined kind of, it's come off of some kind of factory kind of processing plant kind of look. So that's looking cool. Let's go back to edges. Our symmetry's still on. And yeah, I'm just going to do a whole series of bevels now. So this is fantastically interesting, I'm sure. I'm going to do these at the same time. In fact, I'm going to do all of these at the same time, because they're all probably going to bevel roughly the same amount. Segments 2, and pull them in so they're nice and tight, like that. Excellent. So now I'm in object mode again. I'm going to hit 3. That's what I want it to look like. So it's, you know, the actual polygons, me shaping it, there was hardly any polygons going on. All these extra polygons are mostly coming from the bevels. The shaping of it was super simple. To get this nice curved look is a case of using bevel, but with a much higher fraction. The end result of all of this, of doing it in this kind of slow, deliberate, economical kind of way, is that when you smooth it, it looks properly smooth. It doesn't look kind of wobbly. It doesn't look sort of handmade as such, because we're not going for a handmade look here. We're going for a sort of futuristic machine kind of look. So you want to just model with the least amount of polygons, let things like bevel do the heavy lifting for you when it comes to getting smooth curves kind of going on here. But anyway, that's the gist. That's all the modeling I'm going to do. I'm not going to do any more modeling on that. I told you it's going to be really quick and easy. But we do briefly need to talk about UVs again. Now, what are UVs? If I was to take this into Substance Painter now, I would not have a very nice time of it, because the UVs to this object are going to be a complete mess. But what are UVs? UVs are almost as if you unstretched this, and this was like made of a single bit of paper, and then you just pulled and stretched this bit of paper, this object out until it was a flat bit of paper, so that none of these vertices were overlapping each other, and they were all kind of evenly spread out. Now the UVs are a bit like the sort of the part that the textures get assigned to. It's a bit of a head, an interesting thing for your head, but it's what the UVs look like at the moment. So you can see your UVs by going to the UV editor. This won't show up, by the way. If at any point you've accidentally gone to rendering, or heaven help you, animation or FX, you won't see that UVs. They exist in the modeling part. And you go to UV and UV editor. And yeah, look at that. It's all crisscrossed over. This is the end result of this object. All the lines just being overlapped each other in this kind of 1 by 1 square. And the textures are kind of stuck in this UV editor to what these no longer are vertices. In the UV editor, they're called UV kind of points. When you do UV editing on a human or an animal or a character, it tends to look as if you hunted them, killed them, skinned them, and then sort of stretched it out to make a rug. And they literally do call UVs in that respect pelts. Well, that's one of the nicknames for them, because they do look like sort of hunter's trophies. But you need UVs to do any kind of texturing work. Without them, your textures aren't going to work. And at the moment, the UVs on this are horrible. What you want, and you can see actually, you can put a little sort of stand-in texture by clicking the little checkerboard that creates a sort of checkerboard sort of texture. And at the moment, if I was to create some textures in Substance or Photoshop or wherever, and then apply them to this object, they would have this horrible, scuzzy kind of layout all over the object. So that doesn't look good. So you need to make UVs that look good once you've got an object ready. Now, this is intro to CGI, so we're going to be using mostly this super useful one-click solution called Automatic. And concept artists, to be honest, probably never need to go much beyond using this. If you were doing games art, you would probably be thrown out of the class if you started using Automatic, I would assume. VFX people, although I don't think there's any VFX people in this room, they need to know a little bit more about it, because they need to understand exactly what's going on with the UVs, and they need to get pretty good at it. But concept artists, thankfully, don't have to do much in terms of learning how to use UVs. Let's turn that off, but just talk about one more thing before I apply nicer UVs to this object. At the moment, if I hit 3, it looks lovely and smooth. Now, even though Arnold would render this smooth, in fact, let's just sort of prove it. I'm going to create just a simple sun and sky, and open up the Arnold render viewer. There you go. So it looks all nice and smooth. So Arnold is actually knows or can read Maya's press 3 to make it preview smooth. The problem is Substance can't read that. When you bring this into Substance Painter, even if you've pressed 3, Substance Painter is going to look at it as if it looks like that. And as we'll see, that's going to mess up, or that could mess up, certain parts of the substance painting process. So it's a bit of a chore, and it's not ideal, and there are kind of better ways to do it, but those better ways are a little bit more technically involved. And again, this is introduction to CGI, so I'm trying to do everything I can to make it as easy to follow as possible. But I understand that if you have never done any kind of CGI or any 3D before, and if you've never done any digital before, it's still probably quite bewildering. So, but I do go to the effort to try and make it easier. So this isn't necessarily the best way that I'm going to show you, but this is an easier way. So we press 3, and our object looks like that. Now let's actually turn that preview into what they call bake it, and actually make all the little polygons that make it smooth actually appear out of nowhere. So it'll end up looking a lot denser than that. So if I press 3 on an object, and then I go to modify in Maya, and I whiz all the way down to convert. Got a whole bunch of conversion things you can do in Maya. They're all just chucked in there with not much consideration for people learning it. But the one you want, if you want to turn this into a smooth version, is this smooth mesh preview to polygons. Once you click that, it's literally now created. I'm no longer pressing 3. That's now what the object looks like by default. So it's actually created 4 times as many polygons as there were before, because that's what happens when you press 3. It essentially multiplies the polygon count by 4. Every face becomes 4 faces to get that smoothness. You could still press 3 on this object. So if you press 3 on this object, it's even smoother. But to be honest, I doubt whether, unless you got crazy close, whether you'd be able to tell much of a difference. And if you're going to get this close to an object in CGI, you're going to want to start taking it into ZBrush and sculpting on it anyway. But anyway, now that this object is super smooth, this means when I export it to Substance Painter, Substance Painter will see it this smooth too. And so when I bring back the textures from Substance Painter onto the object, everything will actually, well, it will look fairly similar. But let's get some UVs onto this. So we're going to do this in 2 stages. This is one of the most important things I want you to pick up today about UVs, but I also want you to realize it's super easy to do. So you select your object that you're about to send to Substance Painter, you've pre-smoothed it, you've converted it, you go to UV, you hit automatic, and it kind of switches you into face mode. So go out of that, and let's have a look at the UV editor this time. Okay, this is what Automatic has done. Automatic has broken down, it's essentially projected 6 little invisible projections from all the different possible sides, as if there was an invisible cube around this object, and then that invisible cube was projecting from each one of its faces inwards. And what that essentially does is it cuts the object up automatically into a lot of different parts. So if I put my little checkerboard swatch on this time now you can see those checkerboards don't look all scuzzy and kind of all jagged and frizzy and that kind of thing. That's a little bit more like we want our UVs to look. But we need to do just one more thing to make the UVs, I'm not going to say perfect because they're not going to be perfect, but the best they can be in this situation to send to Substance. We need to lay out these UVs so that they maximize the amount of space they can get in this kind of little square here, because this is what we're interested in. There is space outside, but we want everything to fit into this little box. It's a bit like, yeah, it's a bit like sort of just rearranging, household rearranging and figuring out the perfect fit. But we let kind of Maya do it for us by using Modify, Layout, and it's got a little box. This is the option box. So you click that. You've got a whole bunch of options now for the laying out the UVs. I'm going to reset this just to show you what it looks like. Now there's a load of options in here. Again, it's bewildering, but don't worry, you don't need to fiddle around with much of this at all. When you first do it, probably best to do reset settings, edit reset settings, just to make sure we're all working at the same kind of starting point. This is all you really need to know. You need to do pre-shell rotation. Now you can have this horizontal or vertical, it doesn't really matter. But the really super important one is this one called shell pre-scaling, and you want to put preserve 3D ratios. What that is going to do, you see all these segments here, each one of these are called UV shells. These are these kind of the object broken up into little pieces. Like now it's a single bit of paper that you've put little cut lines across, and now you've cut them all out with a scalpel, and then you're laying them out perfectly and arranging them. Each one of these, you can actually see the thicker lines is where the cut lines happen. You want the proportions of each one of these to each other to obey the proportions that the features have actually in the 3D to make the textures smoothly travel across them. Again, it's a bit of a weird one to explain. There's probably better ways of doing it. The upshot is it meant that if these were all different, actually maybe I can show you. So at the moment the squares look reasonably even. We've got some stretching here where there's some of these checkerboard squares look longer and thinner. The goal is to have perfect texturing, is to have all the squares on our object perfectly square, like they are maybe on this bit. And so that meant that if in Substance, if I started painting across 2 different bits, the resolution of if I painted here would be the same as if I painted here, because the resolution of the squares is the same. But if I went, let's choose that actually. If I chose this shell here, let's say that this shell was a lot smaller. Now you can actually see, if I make this shell smaller in the viewport, it's only got those squares in it. You can see the squares that exist within the shell, and you can see how they match up in the viewport. So there's a lot less resolution in here. And it's also uneven resolution compared to what's surrounding it. So the goal is, the ultimate goal is to have these squares to be as small as possible all over the object and all completely the same kind of small kind of size, which means you're getting the maximum amount of resolution out of it. But as I said, Maya kind of tries to make this easy for you by giving you this layout function that does a bunch for you. And it's this preserve 3D ratio that attempts to maintain even resolution here. I don't know, that's probably more confusing when I started to explain it there. But again, you, as concept artists, and even as maybe VR artists, you maybe don't need to worry too much about it at the moment. It is intro to CGI again, after all. The only thing else you need to do here, you can forget about everything else, don't have to worry about this, don't have to worry about this, is the shell padding and tile padding. And what that is it tells Maya to lay these little segments out, these little shells out, to the maximum amount so that it gets the most amount of resolution possible, but to leave a certain amount of space between each one of these shells, and to leave a certain amount of space between the shells and the border around the outside edge. The reason why that's kind of important is that when you map 2D pixels that come out of substance onto 3D objects, there's always going to be some what they call bleed. Some of the pixels, you know, you're not going to get a pixel that perfectly lines up with the edge here. You're going to get pixels that sort of sit half on and half off of this UV shell. It's an inherent part of the fact that we're dealing with a finite resolution of texture, but on a kind of sort of infinite level of resolution in 3D. The padding just gives a little bit of breathing room around each shell and around the borders, meaning that when the pixels do bleed over the edge, they're not going to accidentally bleed onto another UV shell and show up where they're not wanted. And this, at the moment, you set these padding units in pixels. I, just out of habit, put 10 in both. It's worked for me, so I'm happy to go with 10. This might be a bit smaller. If you've got an extremely complicated object with maybe millions of little UV shells in it, well, I hope you didn't have millions, otherwise, yeah, you'd be in trouble. But if you've got like one with lots and lots and lots of little pieces of UV shells, you might want this shell padding to either be a bit bigger or a bit smaller. But 10, I always think, is a reasonably good place to start. And then you just go lay out UVs. Maya thinks for a little bit. Oh, problem is, I did the UV layout there only on one shell, because I only had one shell selected. You want to do this on the whole object. So go to object mode and select it, and do it again. So yeah, that's actually, I guess that's a good thing to be aware of. If it only does it on one shell, that's because you only had one shell selected. If you want to do it to the whole object, be in object mode and do it. So I'm going to do layout UVs again. Remembers all my previous settings. Yeah, so it's sort of laid them all out, and it's done its best to maximize the amount of area here. So put that back on there. Yeah, I got a bit of distortion going on here, but I can live with that. It's not actually that much different from when it was not laid out, but it's always good to do. Right. Okay, so that's almost the first part of the session done. This is now good to send to Substance Painter. So it's got UVs, it's been pre-smoothed, and so now I'm going to go File, Export Selection. I'm going to put it in Assets of Anthony's project. I'm going to keep it as an FBX. Right. When you do this, it might be set to something else. Might be OBJ. Actually, it might very well be Maya ASCII. What you want to do is you want to make sure that it's set to FBX export, and then call this something. Wall panel. Don't need to do anything else. Export selection, and that's now ready to take in to substance and texture, and that's where we're going to call it half time